Okay, looks like we've dropped out in the right place. Welcome to the Ghoul Stars, or at least the inside edge of them anyway. Normally I would park up in high orbit over the homeworld for today's Legion, but there actually isn't one anymore, as it was destroyed by the Legion's Primarch towards the end of the Great Crusade. It was a world of perpetual night and rampant crime, and the home for a Legion that struck terror into the hearts of all. This legion was one of the 9 to turn on the Emperor during the Horus Heresy, but to call them agents of chaos is perhaps an overstatement, for many within the legion believe themselves free of chaos and fight only for material power. They are a fractured force in the modern era, scattered throughout the Eye of Terror, but their warbands will often hold true to the ideals of the legion. Unlike the word bearers who we covered previously, their Primarch is dead, slain after the heresy by an agent of the Assassinorium. His name was Konrad Curze, the Night Haunter, and his sons were the 8th Legion Astartes, the Night Lords. My name is Michael for Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to Legions, a 40k Stories mini-series. The 8th Legion were not named before they discovered their Primarch, at least not in any official records. This was apparently the norm, whilst the Imperial Heralds who would become the word-bearers were the exception. They were created from the gene seed of Konrad Curze before he was spirited away by chaos, along with the rest of the Primarchs. Their initial recruits were in fact children of prisoners on Terra, specifically the region of Albia, raised in the midst of darkness and death. Even before the reunion with Curze, the 8th Legion were a brutal force in the Great Crusade. Their only major confirmed action pre-Curze was the Venori Resurgence, when a city on Terra conquered in the Unification Wars went back to the nightmares of the Age of Strife. The 8th were dispatched to deal with Venori, and did it in what would become typical Night Lord fashion. A massive bombardment was followed up with a rain of hallucinogenic chemicals before the Astartes came. Overwhelming the enemy's monstrous creations through numbers and encirclement, the 8th cut down all who fled, either at the time or a little bit later. The final act came when the Crimson Walkers, the rulers of Venori who had ushered the horrors in, were thrown off a cliff, and the city was sent into the same chasm via demolition charges. Brutal. There are sadly no known 8th Legion engagements away from Terra during the Crusade, which is perhaps surprising given how long it took to find the Legion's Primarch. Eventually, though, the Great Crusade arrived here, where Nostramo used to be, and found Konrad Curze, the 16th Primarch, to be rediscovered. Konrad Curze landed on Nostramo in characteristically terrifying fashion. Rather than being teleported by the Chaos Gods, his gestation pod arrived through orbit, crashing through the adamantium-rich surface of the planet and into its core. Growing up alone in the city of Nostramo Quintus and living off the feral animals within it, he was instilled with a strong sense of justice, even if his methods were extreme. Nostramo had a thriving mining trade based on the adamantium in its crust, but almost the entire population lived in poverty, and the numbers were only kept in check by an incredibly high murder and suicide rate. Curze started a solo vigilante campaign, initially interrupting crimes in progress that he came across, but eventually becoming a hunter of all those who transgressed his moral code. Corrupt officials disappeared, prominent criminals were found gutted in the streets, and tales of the Night Haunter terrified children into obedience and sent the Nostramo Quintus crime rate plummeting to basically zero within the year. Curze then finally revealed himself to those he had not killed, seeing hope for them now that they feared and hated him above all others. He was installed as the leader of the city, and turned out to be a fair, just ruler until crimes were committed, at which point the Night Haunter would reappear and hunt them down. An era of honesty followed, both in Nostramo Quintus and across the rest of the world, as they heard tales of the Night Haunter and wished to keep him as far away from their door as possible. Not long after Curze's rule began, the Imperium of Man arrived on Nostramo. The radiant light of the Emperor blinded almost all who looked upon him, due to the eternal night of Nostromo caused by the synchronized orbit with the planet's moon. Curze stood before his father and the delegation accompanying him, including the Primarchs Fulgrim and Rogel Dawn, but was struck by a vision of intense magnitude. He had been haunted by visions of dark futures for all of his life and would continue to be so until his dying day. But this waking dream was so lucid and horrific that he attempted to claw out his own eyes in response to it. He was stopped by the Emperor, but he was seeing both his death and the fate of all before him. When the Emperor spoke to him, he responded in typically epic fashion.
Konrad Curze, be at peace, for I have arrived and intend to take you home.
That is not my name, Father. I am Night Haunter, and I know full well what you intend for me.
When Curze rejoined the Imperium, he trained under Fulgrim before being given command of the 8th Legion, renaming them the Night Lords. His sons diligently adapted to their Primarch and moulded his beliefs into official, proper tactics. The Night Lords were a decisive and somewhat excessive force, always hitting extremely hard and making sure everyone knew about it through announcements or propaganda. This meant that the Night Lords were actually kept away from the front line of the Great Crusade, which had now crossed almost the entire galaxy and was starting to suffer from worlds falling out of compliance or that had never fully achieved it. The 8th Legion were the ultimate terror tool, cementing Imperial rule through fear, just as the Night Haunter had once done on Nostromo. In fact, the Night Lords became so infamous that even a whisper of their coming could force a world to fall into perfect compliance, clearing its debts and rooting out any heretics. As such, there are very few compliance actions recorded for the Night Lords, mainly pacification ones, but there is one event that I feel is worthy of note. On the world of Chero, Curze chose to confide in his mentor Fulgrim about the visions he had been having, which were becoming more and more lucid as the Crusade continued and had begun to tell of the upcoming civil war. Fulgrim thought it wise to speak to Rogel Dawn on the issue, who then went to confront Curze. Yet Curze, believing that Fulgrim had betrayed his trust in telling Dawn, flew into a rage and attacked the Praetorian of Terror. He was arrested, but escaped soon after, leaving a trail of dead Imperial fists in his wake. Rejoining the Night Lord's fleet, Curze bade his sons head to Nostromo to deal with their home. Nostromo had gone backwards once more after the terror of Night Haunter departed. Crime ruled once more, and only the strongest criminals survived to become potential Night Lords. As a result, Curze was in fact the only Primarch to have disdain or hatred for his own legionaries, though it is noted that they still respected and even loved him. When the Night Lords finally returned, pursued by other Imperials, they turned their potent laser batteries on their former home. It is said that Curze's crash had weakened a portion of the surface that the Night Lords chose to attack. But whatever the reason, the planet's core overheated and Nostromo was destroyed. The timeline is slightly vague after this. Some say that the Emperor ordered the recall of the Night Lords immediately after Nostromo died. Others that the Night Lords were on campaign for a while longer, but committed such atrocities that the Emperor was forced to recall them. But whenever the recall happened, it was far too late, for the Horus Heresy broke out not long after, and all circumstances changed. Either because imperial bureaucracy or desperation, the Night Lords were not in fact returned to Terra, but instead dispatched to Istvan V. As with all reserve elements sent to Istvan V, the Night Lords revealed their treachery in the Drop Site Massacre. The exact reasons for Curze following Horus are unknown, be it hatred of his father, premonition, the belief that the Imperium would never take him back, or a combination of these or other elements. Regardless, the 8th Legion turned on their brothers and, according to a rough deployment map, probably fought mostly Raven Guard and Iron Hands. Curze himself was very busy in the battle, fighting and defeating 2 of his brother Primarchs. He first saved Lorgar from an untimely death at the hands of Corvus Corax, driving away the Raven Lord through skill and his brother's fatigue. He then found Vulcan, who had regenerated from being nuked by the Iron Warriors because perpetual, and captured him, though he did not know at the time that the Salamander's Primarch was in fact immortal. After extended physical and mental torture and some very imaginative murder, Curze decided to set Vulcan one final challenge, a labyrinth to his weapon followed by a duel, which Vulcan won. Realizing that Curze wanted to be killed by Vulcan to show that the two were both monstrous killers, the Primarch refused to kill his brother and teleported away using his weapon, landing on Macragge. Curze would cross paths with Vulcan later, but the Night Lords spent much of this period on a bloody crusade to presumably sow terror and prevent the Galactic East from reinforcing Terra itself. Assumedly this took place pre-Ruinstorm. They were eventually ambushed by the Dark Angels, who had up to this point been unable to catch the 8th Legion due to extremely effective hit-and-run tactics. This ambush followed a seemingly amicable discussion between Curze and Lionel Johnson, which soured after an insult from the former and a dishonourable blow from the latter, and almost cost the first Primarch his life. Johnson was only saved because his honour guard stabbed Curze in the spine whilst he was strangling his brother. The ambush that followed rendered Curze comatose and left the Night Lords in turmoil, further compounded by a second attack not long after. Curze awoke and returned to allow his sons to escape, but he and his first captain, among others, were trapped on the Invincible Reason, Lion's flagship. His sons were captured, but Curze was able to evade the Dark Angels in the bowels of the vessel. The Lion's forces eventually came to Macragge, cut off by the Ruinstorm from Terra, and Curze took his chance to escape again. Nearly killing Johnson and Guilliman, and then dueling an insane Vulcan across the entire planet, Curze was banished into the warp for a period of time and reappeared before Sanguinius, Emperor of Imperium Secundus, to tell him of his visions of their deaths and to understand his continued loyalty. He escaped again before being captured again by Johnson later on and brought back to Sanguinius' throne room. He was to be executed, first by the Lion and then by Sanguinius, but in a ridiculously confusing argument, Johnson ended up talking Sanguinius down and took Curze as his prisoner more permanently. His reasoning was that Curze's visions were proof that the Emperor was still alive, or something. Eventually, Curze escaped for one final time, rejoining his legion which had already begun to splinter following the battles with the Dark Angels all that time ago. Elements of the Night Lords were present on Terra, but they were not led by Konrad Curze. Curze's exact whereabouts to the end of the heresy are unknown, but it can be assumed that he was with the remaining Night Lords who were either unable to evade the Ruinstorm, were busy on campaign across the Galactic East, or simply could not be bothered to head for Terra. However, the Emperor already had plans in place for dealing with the Night Haunter, and dispatched half of the Kalidas Temple of the Officio Assassinorium to kill Curze. The Terran contingent of the Legion assumedly headed for the Eye of Terror, along with the other traitor legions, but they may have remained in real space or attempted to rejoin their brothers somehow, we do not know. The remaining Night Lords continued their campaigns of terror just as they had done in the heresy, at a much fuller strength than other traitor legions due to the majority not having been on Terra. Eventually, Curze's visions came true, and he was killed on the planet of Salguasa. Excuse my possibly abysmal pronunciation of that. It is said that Curze allowed himself to die, having known his death was coming anyway. In fact, he ordered his legion to allow the assassin M'Shen to do her work and escape without punishment. His final words were, in my opinion, just as badass as those he spoke when he met with the Emperor.
Your presence does not surprise me, assassin. I have known of you ever since your craft entered the eastern fringes. Why did I not have you killed? Because your mission and the act you are about to commit proves the truth of all I have ever said or done. I merely punish those who had wronged, just as your false emperor now seeks to punish me. Death is nothing compared to vindication.
Following Curze's death, the Night Lords splintered fully into warbands based on the Legion's company structure, and eventually moved to the Eye of Terror, presumably to avoid the Imperium and allow them to raid the galaxy on a wider scale. And so we come to the end of the tale of the Night Lords as a legion, for they now operate very independently. But who were the big players in the 8th Legion whilst it was a cohesive force, besides the Night Haunter? The Atramentar were the first company of the Night Lords, elite warriors all equipped with Terminator armor. Ironically perhaps, their leader, and thus the first captain of the Legion, was the only one among them who did not. His name was Jago Sevatarian, known as the Prince of Crows, or more commonly, Sevatar. Born and raised in Nostramo Quintus, the same city as Curze himself, Sevatar was in fact a Psyker and joined the Night Lords about a century before the heresy. Nostramo had gone fully back to pre-Night Haunter by this point, as its death came not that much later. Whilst he attempted and succeeded in suppressing his psychic power, Curze was still fully aware of what his first captain could do, because Curze. Note that even whilst fighting for Chaos, Sevatar still never used his power in battle. In all honesty, Sevatar had no need for psychic power, as his physical abilities were on par with legends such as Abaddon of the Sons of Horus and Eidolon of the Emperor's Children. He was also first to coin the now iconic phrase, "Death to the False Emperor," after Lorgar's speech on Isfahan 5 pre-Drop Site Massacre. And yet, I have my suspicions that Sevatar embodied the Night Lord's lack of loyalty to Chaos, as he despised the Word-Bearers for their use of demons or possessed like the Galvor back. The Prince of Crows was part of Curze's bodyguard when they met the Dark Angels for that aforementioned chat, and killed the 9th Master of the First Legion in the ensuing fight. Not sure if this was the one who stabbed Curze's spine. If it was, he deserved it. Whilst Curze was in a coma, Sevatar actually unlocked his psychic abilities for the purpose of awakening his lord, but failed completely. Before that, however, it was he who took the decision to splinter the 8th Legion, dividing it up into 6 independent, autonomous great companies. He was then captured on the Invincible Reason after joining his Primarch aboard Johnson's flagship with the Atramentar, but he actually played very little part in the fighting, as the use of his psychic power beforehand caused him to pass out. Sadly, after the Night Lords were captured on Macragge, Sevatar's tale ends, sort of abruptly. Some say he died during the heresy, and that the Atramentar dissolved without him because they did not believe any replacement would live up to the Prince of Crows. Some even whisper that he survived without even Curze's knowledge, but this is unlikely, as no demon or Astartes has appeared claiming to be him. He doesn't come across as very subtle, at least as far as I've seen. We may never know the true fate of Jago Sevatarian, but that is perhaps not even the greatest mystery surrounding the former first captain. When he met with the Dark Angels, Sevatar was wearing Sinner's red gauntlets, meaning that Curze would eventually execute him for crimes of, to quote, traitors and fools. When questioned by the Dark Angels which of the two he was, he replied both. The exact reasoning for Sevatar being forced to don the gauntlets have never been revealed, nor why he remained in such a position of authority despite his crimes and impending execution. When the assassin M'Shen came to kill Night Haunter, Curze told his legion to let her pass and to not pursue her when her mission was completed. Whilst the first part of the order was obeyed, as M'Shen encountered no guards en route to the Primarch, the latter was not. Part of this is actually the assassin's fault, as she stole several Night Lord artifacts on her way out from Salguasa, including the Corona Nox, Curze's crown that was seen by the Legion captains as the symbol of office for the leader of the Night Lords. However, one Astartes was set on revenge regardless of his Primarch's will and the assassin's actions, Talos Valcoran, the Soul Hunter. Talos was recruited into the Legion very late in the Great Crusade, perhaps part of one of the last few waves to leave Nostrama, and was assigned to the 10th Company, where he became an apothecary. He was part of the contingent of Night Lords that fought on Terra, where his life was saved by the Sergeant Vandred Anrathi, who led First Claw, the first squad of the 10th Company, of which Talos was also a member. Valcoran had also been part of Curze's inner circle, sharing a close bond with the Primarch. The exact reason is unspecified, but it is probably due to Talos' power of foresight and vision that he shared with his father. This may also be why Talos was so hell-bent on vengeance against M'Shen, whilst it took the knowledge of the Corona Nox's theft to drive other legionaries to pursue the assassin, and it is this fact that gives him the name Soul Hunter, for he pursued one soul, M'Shen's, whilst all others turned their backs on vengeance. Talos was able to catch the assassin before she even escaped Salguasa, but she escaped him, forcing the Night Lords to chase her down. It is unconfirmed where she was eventually caught again, but Soul Hunter got his prey and tore her apart. Again, just as Curze predicted, because he's Konrad flipping Curze. He was able to recover a copy of the vidlog of Shen's encounter with the Night Haunter, which was distributed across the entire Legion so they could see their father one last time. The log ended just as battle was joined, so they were spared watching him die. Talos eventually came to become leader of First Claw, and after warring with the Red Corsairs led by Huron Blackheart, they returned to Salguasa following a vision by the Soul Hunter. There, they were ambushed by Eldar of Craftwood Ulthway, led by the Phoenix Lord Jane Zar. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Jane Zar was a far superior fighter, and impaled the apothecary on her spear. This was all a ploy by Talos, however, as he used a grenade, killing himself and crippling the Phoenix Lord, who was then finished off by the dreadnought Malkarian, captain of the 10th Company during the Crusade and Heresy, who had died on Terra. Finally, for the notable Heresy-era Night Lords, we have Fel Zarost. Zarost was Terran-born, from the region of Albia, which is, by my best guess, North America, according to Old Earth tradition. Like all initial Night Lords, he had been a prisoner when he was recruited, or at least the child of one. He was part of the Legion when Curze was discovered, and immediately noticed the changes in the 8th when they became the Night Lords and began to recruit from Nostrama. The old traditions died out, torture became more commonplace, and the Nostraman contingent didn't care a jot for their Terran brothers, who they saw as nostalgics, who weren't true Night Lords. Despite this, Zarost was still the chief librarian of the Night Lords when the Edict of Nicaea was passed and the Legion's librarium was disbanded by force. With Curze supposedly awaiting judgment from his brothers at the time, perhaps this was around the time of the attack on Rogel Dawn, cannot confirm, he travelled to meet Sevatar as the current highest-ranked member of the Legion in order to discuss the way forward. Perhaps because of his own suppressed abilities, Sevatar rebuffed the former chief librarian repeatedly, to the point where he ended up flattening Zarost for not shutting up about it, telling him he would wear the Sinner's gauntlets, it is unconfirmed if Sevatar wore them at this time, and be chucked out of the Night Lords. In response, Zarost flew into a raging rant about the path the Legion had taken since Nostrama, but Sevatar blanked him, causing the librarian to attack the first captain with a barrage of psychic power whilst continuing to hurl abuse at him. Sevatar eventually put a stop to this by triggering his own psychic abilities to throw Zarost back, but rather than be killed, the librarian was banished, returning to Albia. There he remained in blissful ignorance until the Horus Heresy, when a mysterious Astartes came for him. Assuming him to be an executioner, the Night Lord showed the Astartes his life through psychic projection, and requested to see the sun for one last time. However, his second psychic probe shocked him, as reading the stranger's mind showed him both the outbreak of the heresy and much more, and in that moment, Zarost knew his fate. The Astartes before him was Nathaniel Garrow, former member of the Death Guard Legion, and now leader of the Knights Errant, who had come to bring him to Malgador the Sigillite and induct him into the Knights. Fel Zarost left willingly with Garrow, knowing full well what would become of him, which in my opinion was to become a founder of the Grey Knights. So end the tales of the Night Lord's Legion. They were intimidating before the discovery of their Primarch, terrifying afterwards, and their brutal tactics were incredibly efficient in serving the goals of Chaos, the Imperium, or themselves. They may now be without their Primarch and lacking any home, but this does not make them any less dangerous, and if I'm honest, I'm a huge fan of Curze, so factor in some bias in anything opinion-based that I said. I hope you enjoyed the second part of Legions, our mini-series looking at each Legion Astartes in turn. We have a huge journey ahead of us to get to both our next Legion stop and the stop-off point I want to visit on the way. Plus, I'm going to have to dodge a horde of Imperial countermeasures to get there, but I hope we can get there in good time. Also, if I check my calendar, I believe that tomorrow is the traditional date for the Old Terran celebration known as Christmas. So if you are celebrating that, then I wish you a pleasant day and that you are not plagued by the visions synonymous with the Night Haunter. For now, though, it is time to bid what was once Nostramo adieu and head for Mars. Thank you all for watching. My name is Michael for Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again. Goodbye.